Is a hero still a hero if no one's allowed to know? I don't mean famous. I mean known. Because there's something we don't talk about enough, the psychological violence of invisibility, of doing something that should change how you see yourself forever, but you're forced to pretend it never happened. In 1952, in the frozen skies above North Korea, a 27-year-old Navy pilot fought 7 Soviet MiG-15s alone for 35 minutes. He shot down 4 of them. His plane was shredded, over 200 bullet holes. He landed on muscle memory and a prayer. Then his government told him to forget it ever happened. Not classified, not top secret, erased. And he obeyed for half a century. So here's my question. When you're forced to hide your most defining moment, who are you protecting? And who are you losing? Stay with me on this, because I need you to understand something before we go any further. You've been taught that heroism is loud, that it's medals and parades and recognition, that if something matters, someone will notice. But that's the lie that keeps you small, stuck, and waiting for permission to acknowledge your own worth. Royce Williams' story destroys that myth completely. This isn't just about a fighter pilot. It's about what happens when your truth is inconvenient for the people in power, when your achievement threatens someone else's narrative, when you're told, implicitly or explicitly, that your reality doesn't matter as much as the system's comfort. And here's the insight most people miss. Royce's real battle wasn't in the sky. It was in the 50 years after, when he had to choose between bitterness and dignity, between demanding recognition and building a life worth living even without it. This video will give you 3 things: a reframe on invisible labor. You'll see why the most important things you do might never be celebrated and why that doesn't make them less sacred. A model for holding your truth, even when no one else validates it, even when the world asks you to shrink. And permission to stop performing, to stop waiting for someone else to tell you that what you survived, created, or overcame actually counts. This is for anyone who's ever been told their pain wasn't that bad, their work wasn't that important, or their story wasn't worth telling. Royce Williams is proof that sometimes the world gets it wrong, and you still get to know your own worth. So let me tell you who Royce Williams was before that day in November 1952, because it matters. He wasn't born into privilege or glory. He came into this world in 1925 in rural South Dakota, on a farm where the sky stretched forever and the work was hard and honest. His family didn't have much. They had land and livestock and the kind of quiet resilience that comes from understanding that nature doesn't care about your plans. You work, you adapt, you survive. That was the soil Royce grew up in. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of kid who dreamed of being a hero. He just wanted to be useful, to be good at something, to matter in a quiet, steady way. When World War II ended and the dust settled, Royce found his way to the Navy. Not because he was running toward glory, but because he was good with machines, and he liked the idea of flying. There was something about being up there, above everything, where the rules were simple and the consequences were clear. You either knew what you were doing, or you didn't. And Royce? He knew. He wasn't the best because he was naturally gifted, though he was, but because he worked at it with the same farm boy diligence he'd learned as a child. Show up, pay attention, do the work. No shortcuts. By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, Royce was a trained Navy pilot, and he was assigned to the USS Oriskany, an aircraft carrier deployed to the Sea of Japan. He flew the F-9F Panther, a jet that was solid but not spectacular. It wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, it wasn't the most maneuverable, but it was reliable, and in Royce's hands, that was enough. He flew mission after mission, ground support, reconnaissance, patrol, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines but keeps the war machine running. And Royce was fine with that. He wasn't looking for glory, he was looking to do his job and come home. But here's the thing about war. It doesn't ask your permission before it changes your life. And on November 18, 1952, Royce's life changed in a way that would echo for the next 70 years. It started as a routine patrol. Royce and 3 other pilots were sent up to fly combat air patrol over the waters near North Korea. The weather was brutal. Clouds so thick you could barely see your own wingtips, the kind of white-gray that disorients you. Makes you feel like you're flying inside a dream. The temperature was below freezing. Everything was cold and quiet and tense in the way that only war can be, where even the silence feels like it's holding its breath. And then, out of nowhere, they weren't alone anymore. 7 aircraft dropped out of the clouds above them. Not North Korean planes, Soviet planes. Flown by Soviet pilots. This wasn't supposed to happen. Officially, the United States and the Soviet Union weren't fighting each other. This was a proxy war, remember? We supported South Korea, they supported North Korea, but our guys weren't supposed to be shooting at their guys directly. Except here they were. 7 of the USSR's best pilots in some of the most advanced fighter jets on the planet, descending on 4 American Panthers like wolves on sheep. Royce's squadron leader immediately radioed back to the carrier. The response was clear. Return to base. Get out of there. This is above your pay grade. 3 of the 4 pilots turned back. But Royce stayed. Not because he was reckless, not because he had something to prove, but because those MiGs were already locked on, already diving, and someone had to buy time for his wingman to escape, so he turned into the fight. 1 Panther against 7 MiGs. Do you understand how insane those odds are? The MiG-15 could climb faster, turn tighter, and carried more firepower than Royce's Panther. It was a superior aircraft in nearly every way. And there were 7 of them. What happened next lasted 35 minutes, but I need you to feel every second of it. Imagine you're Royce. Your hands are gripping the stick so hard your knuckles are white. Your heart is slamming against your ribs. The MiGs are everywhere, above you, beside you, behind you. You can hear the rattle of their cannons, the scream of their engines. You see tracers cutting through the air, bright lines of death that miss you by feet, sometimes inches. Your plane shudders every time you pull a hard turn. The G-forces are crushing your chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. But you can't stop thinking, because the moment you stop calculating, adjusting, predicting, you're dead. Royce flew like his life was a mathematical equation. He used deflection shooting, a technique where you don't aim at the enemy plane, you aim at where it's going to be. It requires split-second geometry, an understanding of speed and trajectory and timing that most pilots never master under pressure, but Royce had it. He fired in short, controlled bursts, no wasted ammunition, no panic, just cold, precise violence. And one by one, he started landing hits. The first MiG went down trailing smoke, spinning towards the ocean below. The second exploded midair. The third caught fire and the pilot ejected. The fourth went into an uncontrolled dive. But while he was doing this, the other 3 MiGs were shredding his plane. Cannon rounds punched through his fuselage, his wings, his tail. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his windscreen. His controls started to go soft, unresponsive. He could feel the aircraft dying beneath him. Could feel it losing the will to stay in the air. And still the fight went on. Still he turned and fired and evaded and turned again, his brain running on pure adrenaline and instinct. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime compressed into a half hour, the remaining 3 MiGs broke off. Maybe they were low on fuel, maybe they couldn't believe what they were seeing, maybe they radioed back to their base and someone told them to get the hell out of there before this one American pilot killed them all. Whatever the reason, they fled. And Royce was alone in the sky, his plane barely holding together, his body shaking so violently that he could barely keep his hands steady. He turned towards the Orskany. The carrier was miles away and every second felt like his aircraft might just fall apart. The hydraulics were failing. The fuel gauge was dropping. There were holes everywhere. Later, the maintenance crew would count 263 bullet holes in that Panther. 263! The fact that it was still flying was a miracle. The fact that Royce was still conscious was another. He nursed the stick, coaxing the plane forward like you'd coax a dying animal to take one more step. Just one more. Just a little further. And somehow, impossibly, he made it back. He lined up for the carrier deck, dropped his landing gear, and brought that shattered plane down onto the steel in one piece. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with sweat. Despite the freezing temperature, his legs were shaking, his hands wouldn't stop trembling. The ground crew surrounded the plane, staring in disbelief. They'd never seen anything like this.
This thing shouldn't have flown. It shouldn't have landed. And the pilot who had just brought it home had just pulled off one of the most stunning aerial victories in the history of combat aviation. 4 MiG-15s destroyed. 7 engaged. 35 minutes alone against the Soviet Union's best. Someone handed Royce a cup of coffee. He stood there on the deck, still shaking, still processing, waiting for someone to say something to acknowledge what had just happened. And then the officers arrived. And instead of medals, instead of congratulations, they told him something that would shape the rest of his life. This didn't happen. You can't tell anyone. Not your wife, not your family, not your squadron mates who weren't there. Operational security, national security. The Cold War is bigger than you, Williams. The USSR can't admit they sent pilots into the fight, and we can't admit...
The USSR can't admit they sent pilots into the fight, and we can't admit we shot them down. So this mission is now classified. Not top secret. Erased. You understand? And Royce, because he was a good sailor, because he'd been raised to follow orders and trust authority, said yes, sir. He went to the debriefing. He signed whatever they put in front of him, and then he went back to his bunk and tried to sleep, knowing that the most extraordinary thing he would ever do had just been taken from him. 50 years. I need you to sit with that number. 50 years of carrying that day inside him like a stone in his chest. 50 years of watching other pilots receive medals for missions that didn't come close to what he'd done. 50 years of family dinners and reunions and quiet moments where someone would ask, "Hey, Royce, what was Korea like?" And he'd smile and deflect and change the subject because what was he supposed to say? He couldn't tell them. Not because it was classified in the traditional sense. There was no official documentation, no paper trail, nothing that said this mission ever happened. It had been erased so thoroughly that if Royce had tried to talk about it, he would have sounded like he was making it up, like he was an old man embellishing war stories to feel important. But it wasn't about feeling important. It was about being seen. Do you understand the difference? When something happens to you, something that fundamentally changes who you are, you need to name it. You need to say it out loud so that it becomes real, so that you can integrate it into your identity. Otherwise, it just sits there inside you, undigested, unprocessed, a ghost that haunts every quiet moment. Royce couldn't do that. He couldn't say, "I survived the impossible. I was outnumbered 7-1 and I won. I should be dead and I'm not." He had to swallow it, had to pretend it was just another day. And that kind of psychological violence, being forced to deny your own reality, it does something to you. Here's what kills me about Royce's story. He wasn't bitter. He didn't spend 50 years angry at the Navy or the government or the system that erased him. He could have. God knows he would have been justified. But instead, he just lived. He came home from Korea. He continued his career. He flew planes because he loved flying, not because he needed the validation. He got married. He had children. He built a life that wasn't defined by that one day, even though that day was always there, just beneath the surface, a secret he carried alone. And I think about what that cost him. Not in terms of medals or recognition, though that matters too, but in terms of connection. Because when you have a secret that big, it creates a wall between you and everyone you love, not because you want it to, but because there's this part of you that no one's allowed to see. Your wife asks how your day was, and you can't tell her about the day that mattered most. Your kids ask what you did in the war, and you give them the sanitized version, the version that doesn't include the truth. And over time, that wall becomes so familiar you forget it's there. You forget what it would feel like to be fully known. The years passed. The Cold War thawed. Royce retired from the Navy. He settled into civilian life, working, flying for pleasure, spending time with his grandchildren. And then, in the 1990s,
something extraordinary happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives were opened. Russian military historians started digging through old records trying to piece together what really happened during the Cold War. And they found something. A report from November 18th, 1952. 4 MiG-15 fighters lost in an engagement over the Sea of Japan. Pilots killed. Cause: 1 American pilot in an F-9F Panther. The Russians couldn't believe it. They started asking questions. Who was this pilot? How did he do it? They reached out to American military historians, and slowly, piece by piece, the story started to come out. Someone found Royce. Someone asked him if it was true. And for the first time in almost 50 years, Royce was allowed to say yes. Yes, it happened. Yes, it was me. Yes, I've been carrying this alone since 1952. The story broke in 2002. The New York Times published an article about him. Other outlets picked it up. Suddenly, this quiet, humble man in his late 70s was being interviewed, asked to relive that day, asked how it felt to finally be able to talk about it. And you know what Royce said? He said it was a relief. Not because he needed the attention, but because he could finally stop pretending. He could finally integrate that day into his story, could finally say out loud, "This is who I am. This is what I did." And it was real. But here's the part that breaks my heart. By the time the recognition came, most of the people who should have known were gone. His parents, who raised him to be steady and brave, they never knew. The buddies he served with, the ones who would have understood what it meant, most of them were dead or too old to fully appreciate it. His younger self, the 27-year-old who landed that shot-up Panther and needed someone to tell him he mattered, he never got that. The recognition came 50 years too late to heal the wound it was meant to heal. In 2023, at the age of 97, Royce Williams was finally awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States. It was a ceremony. There were speeches. People called him a hero, called what he did legendary. And it was. It absolutely was. But I keep thinking about Royce standing there, this old man who'd spent most of his life carrying this story alone, and wondering, does this feel like closure? Or does it feel like a reminder of everything he lost? Because here's what we don't talk about enough. Late recognition doesn't undo early erasure. It doesn't give you back the 50 years you spent feeling invisible. It doesn't repair the relationships that were strained because you couldn't be fully honest. It doesn't heal the part of you that learned deep down that your truth doesn't matter as much as other people's comfort. The medal is meaningful, of course it is, but it's not the same as being seen when you needed it most. And that brings me to the deeper lesson here, the thing I need you to understand if you take nothing else from this story. Royce Williams' story isn't really about war. It's not even really about heroism in the traditional sense. It's about selfhood under erasure. It's about what happens when your reality is denied, when the thing that should define you is taken away, and you have to figure out how to be a whole person anyway. And here's the truth that Royce's life teaches us. You don't need the world's permission to know your own truth. Listen to that again. You don't need the world's permission to know your own truth. Royce knew what he did. He knew he survived the impossible. He knew he was one of the greatest combat pilots in history, even if no one else did. And that knowledge, that private, internal knowing, it had to be enough. Because waiting for external validation would have destroyed him. Spending 50 years bitter and resentful demanding recognition that wasn't coming would have poisoned every good thing in his life. So instead, he chose something else. He chose dignity. And dignity in this context doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It doesn't mean being a martyr or swallowing your pain with a smile. Dignity means deciding that your worth isn't contingent on other people's acknowledgement. It means building a life that matters, even when no one's watching, even when no one's applauding. It means holding your truth gently, privately, sacredly, and not letting the absence of recognition corrode your soul. Because here's what I've learned, and what Royce's story confirmed for me. Some things are sacred even if they're invisible. The fight mattered whether or not anyone ever knew about it. The courage it took to stay in the air for 35 minutes, to land that plane, to walk away from that cockpit, that mattered. And the 50 years of quiet strength it took to carry that story without bitterness, to build a family and a life and a sense of self that wasn't defined by external validation, that mattered too. Maybe even more. And I think we need this story right now, in this moment, because we're living in a culture that's obsessed with visibility, with being seen, being recognized, being validated by strangers on the internet. We've been taught that if something isn't witnessed, it doesn't count. If your pain isn't acknowledged, it's not real. If your work isn't celebrated, it doesn't matter. And that's killing us. It's making us perform our lives instead of living them. It's making us wait for permission to feel proud, to feel worthy, to feel like we matter. But Royce Williams is proof that the opposite is true. Your invisible labor, the caregiving, the late nights, the emotional heavy lifting, the work you do that no one sees, it counts. Your unwitnessed pain, the grief you processed alone, the trauma you survived without support, the quiet strength it took to get through the hardest days of your life, it's real. Your unrecognized achievements, the projects that were stolen, the ideas that were ignored, the contributions that were erased, they still happened. They still shaped the world, even if your name isn't attached to them. And the people who were supposed to see you and didn't, that's their failure, not yours. That's the system's failure. That's the limitation of institutions and hierarchies and cultures that prioritize comfort over truth. But it doesn't define your worth. It never did. I think about Royce a lot when I'm working with people who feel invisible, the mothers who give everything and are taken for granted, the employees whose ideas get credited to their bosses, the survivors whose abusers were believed instead, the artists whose work is stolen, repackaged, sold by someone else, the activists who do the groundwork while someone else gets the spotlight. All of them carrying stories that matter, truths that are real, labor that is sacred, and no one sees it, no one names it. And they're left wondering, did it even count? And what I want to tell them, what I want to tell you, is this: it counted. It all counted. Even if no one was watching, even if no one said thank you, even if the credit went to someone else, you were there. You did the thing. You survived. You built. You fought. You held on. And that is real, whether or not anyone acknowledges it. But here's the part that's hard, the part that Royce also shows us. You can't wait for recognition to give you permission to move forward. You can't put your life on hold until someone finally sees you, because that day might never come. The medal might arrive when you're 97, too late to change anything. The apology might never be spoken. The acknowledgement might never arrive. And if your sense of self is contingent on those things, you'll spend your whole life in that waiting room, getting smaller and smaller, more and more bitter. So what do you do instead? You do what Royce did. You hold your truth privately. You build a life that's worth living regardless of whether anyone's applauding. You love the people in front of you. You show up for the things that matter. You let go of the fantasy that someday someone will finally understand, and you choose to understand yourself instead, to see yourself, to validate yourself. And that doesn't mean you never advocate for recognition. It doesn't mean you accept injustice passively. Royce eventually told his story when he was allowed to. He accepted the medal when it came. But he didn't spend 50 years consumed by the lack of it. He didn't let the erasure define him. And that's the balance, holding your truth while also holding your life, not sacrificing one for the other. He is 100 years old. He lived through the Great Depression, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, 9/11, and everything that came after. He has seen a century of human history. And for 72 of those years, the most extraordinary thing he ever did was a secret. But when he died, people knew. The story was out there. And more importantly, he knew. He got to spend the last years of his life being seen, being acknowledged, being recognized as the hero he'd always been. But I keep coming back to this question. What about all the years before that? Were they wasted? Was his life less meaningful because he spent most of it invisible? And I don't think so. I really don't. Because Royce didn't wait for the medal to build a life. He had a family that loved him. He had friends. He kept flying because he loved the sky, not because he needed to prove anything. He laughed, he worked, he found joy in the ordinary moments. He didn't let the absence of recognition corrode his soul. And that is the real heroism. Not the 35 minutes in the cockpit, though my God, what a 35 minutes, but the 50 years after, when he chose dignity over bitterness, grace over resentment, life over waiting. So here's what I want you to take from this. Here's the mantra I want you to carry. You are not invisible just because you are unseen. Your truth doesn't need an audience to be real. And the people who were supposed to recognize you and didn't, that's their failure, not yours. That's the system's failure. That's the limitation of institutions and hierarchies and cultures that prioritize comfort over truth. You get to know your own worth. You get to hold your story. You get to build a life that matters even if no one's watching. Because the watching was never the point. The living was. And if you're carrying something right now, something you survived, something you did, something that changed you that no one else knows about, I want you to know it counts. It all counts. Even if you never get the medal, even if the apology never comes, even if the recognition arrives 70 years too late or never arrives at all, what you did, what you survived, who you became in the process, that's real. That's sacred. And you don't need anyone's permission to honor it. Royce Williams spent 100 years on this earth. For 72 of them, his greatest moment was erased. But he didn't let it erase him. He held his truth quietly, built a life worth living, and when the recognition finally came, he accepted it with the same grace he'd shown for half a century. He didn't need the medal to know who he was, but when it came, he let it be the cherry on top, not the whole sundae. And that's the wisdom here. That's the lesson. Your worth isn't contingent on being seen, but being seen when it finally happens can still be a gift. Just don't wait for it to start living. So if this story landed for you, if you've ever felt erased or overlooked or told that your reality didn't matter, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're carrying that no one sees. Not because I need my validation, but because sometimes just naming it out loud is the first step towards setting it down. Sometimes saying this happened to me, or this is what I did, or this is what I survived, is enough to make it real, to integrate it, to stop it from haunting you. And if you want more stories like this, if you want more conversations about resilience and invisible labor and the quiet dignity of people the world overlooked, subscribe, hit the bell. Not because I need the numbers, I appreciate them, but because you deserve reminders that your invisible work matters. You deserve content that sees you, that validates the parts of you the world ignores, that tells you the truth. You're not broken. You've just been unseen. And that ends now. I see you, your story matters, and you don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth.